how much should Australia do to reduce its carbon emissions? Right now,
it's only about.
Sorry, right now it's not doing much at all. Just so we know.
What about you, sir?
The expectation of the world is that much more needs to be done. The indications are that if we don't do that, there will be disasters. And we know that many scientists are linking bushfires and other dangerous developments to a mismanagement of the ecology. We also know that correct action can make things better. When they said there would be a ozone layer hole, right on top of Australia, the whole world agreed that fluorocarbons would be phased out, and they did that. It took 30 years to do it, but after those gases were controlled from the refrigerants, others were replaced according to the Montreal Protocol. Things have become better. The ozone layer has been repaired. Australia was in trouble. There was a tear in the ozone layer. The whole world saw what it could be. In the coming days, they acted and they helped. Australia is a ready, immediate first beneficiary of that global action. I think we can ask Australia to do what is necessary, scientifically required, to make the carbon emissions problem better. Open cast mining, a lot of mining, and not adequate dependence on alternative sources of energy is causing the problem. I think Australia has a lot to do. It is being critiqued by the global community as well, a lot. It's not just the Greens in Australia. I think even Labour Party is uncomfortable with where we are. But the world is alarmed that an advanced economy, a wealthy economy, is not making the right choices. Much more.
What will be the effects of having too much carbon emissions?
I wish there was another button after. Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Okay, if we put too much emphasis on carbon emissions, what effects it will have on growth, infrastructure, and minings? If you go for very extreme, much more, maybe it might pull the economy back. So I would think that somewhat more.
Okay. Yeah, that's definitely a trade-off. The economy will suffer as a result of it, which is an undeniable fact.
That's true. You see, having lived in Europe for a long time, and of course India, and having been around in Australia for a brief while now, I see that the economy, while it's a rich economy, is not structured like, let's say, in Western Europe or Northern America. So there's a lot of raw material export still, isn't there? Whereas value-added goods, value-added services bring in more money. And the economy is not being challenged to reform, to upgrade itself. This is what I think. I mean, how long will you sell lobster to China? And then how long will you sell iron ore and carbon to other countries? And then tweak the rules around which whether you should be selling this amount of coal to that country, which doesn't do the following, and so on. Why isn't there, for example, an entrepreneurial culture like what we see in the US? Australia is perfectly capable of it. I mean, the US has large levels of poor education, poorly educated people, unskilled people looking for productive jobs or being productive in jobs that they're not skilled for. Australia is not like that. Australia is a giant company in the way it recruits its immigrants. You can't get in if you don't have a master's degree. You can't get in if you don't have skills. So people who are well qualified, well trained, are already coming into the country. So that's why I'm saying it's run like a company is. I mean, most companies interview for a job, but coming into Australia, you have to already qualify like you were selected for a job. So Australia is better placed than most countries to launch the economy at a higher level. Skilled, educated, accomplished people. And that's 25 million of them, of which a third are definitely these that I'm mentioning, because otherwise they wouldn't have got immigration processed. So a country where at least a third of its population is productive and immigrants are allowed within an age limit. So they are of a working age, they're qualified, they're skilled, and skills that the economy wants. So better placed than most countries to march ahead at a great speed, to have a modern economy, active, energetic. And when you reorient the economy that way, then the ecology-related industrial activity will be in balance and less. Look, selling wine, exporting wheat and meat, carbon emissions is linked to methane issues. I mean, yeah, it's not methane emission that we're talking of, but carbon emissions and all are related to potential greenhouse gas effects. And methane does create that problem. And the most active contributor to methane is not so much your cars, but it's the cows and lamb. And if the economy shifts a bit, it'll make it better. It'll make it richer. You still want to say somewhat more only? I was campaigning for much more.
I think so, somewhat more only for me as well. Where do you stand, Arjun?
Look, I would say much more. Look, I look at this closely. I work for an automotive company myself, and we look at the data when it comes to carbon emissions out of auto vehicles. But the fact that Australia hasn't come forward with electric vehicle planning and kind of subsidizing car makers to bring more electric cars, it showed me that there's a laziness, there's a sense of complacency, and there's definitely climate change denial in the highest forms of government in this country. And so I'm so glad that this election, out of, I've been voting for a number of years now, so probably about 15 years now, and this is the first time this has been such a big election issue. So we're making progress. And I think this is the time for the Australian public to, literally stamp their authority on this election by saying this is the most important thing, because for future generations, none of those other questions that we talked about will have as much as an impact as this question. Like that's for sure. And I feel like we tend to ignore it because it's not in our immediate future, and we tend to prioritize, the economy, or we're worried or we're concerned about how it would affect the economy. But from a humanist perspective, I think this is a big call for us to make. This is our legacy that we leave behind for the future generations, I feel. So from that perspective, I'm really strongly inclined towards much more.
I'm not denying the fact that we should definitely have much more, but my concern is we can't go from the current to directly to the much more. We should be doing this gradually so that no other sectors are affected, including farming. You know, with regards to the electric cars that you mentioned, there's also a good point that I heard. When people think that they're driving electric cars, they're thinking that they are clean to the environment. Possibly not, because the electricity that you're getting is not from a clean source. It could be from your could be from your coal. So someone driving an electric car just can't think that they're doing helpful to the environment. Of course, the future generations will be kept in mind, but we can't just go from gear 1 to gear 10 at this point of time. Maybe step by step. Yes,
that's a good point. My only counter argument or two would be, if you look at the numbers in terms of CO2 emissions between a petrol car, like a combustion engine, or even a diesel car, or versus an electric car that's gotten all of its power out of a coal mining or a coal production house, I think you'd still see a significant improvement in CO2 emission numbers. That's one point. And the other point is this step-by-step approach, I agree with, if Australia kind of held on to the rest of the world, if they stayed at the pace that especially Europe has been progressing in terms of their emission strategies. We haven't done that. For the last 20 years, we've lagged behind every respectable target for CO2 emissions. And so it's getting to the point where we can't have that argument of step by step anymore, because we're already lagging behind. If we want to go ahead, we need to really step it up. And unfortunately, the prize is either going to be paid now in terms of the economy, or it's going to be paid in a much more drastic way 20, 30 years from now. So I feel like we've lost the privilege of making these arguments as a nation, unfortunately.
Yeah, valid point, and I agree with you now, much more.
Awesome. Sarath just showed his face quickly and then he disappeared again.
Working day?
Yeah, Monday morning in Canada, I believe. So we'll stick with much more, and we'll move on. Terminally ill patients should be able to end their own lives with medical assistance.